Okay, today we're going to learn Shabbat Daf Tzadi Aleph. Today's shiur is dedicated by Raie Goodwach in memory of her mother Rivkah bat Chaim v'Peshka Zichronah Livracha, and by Nava Flesh in memory of her father Oriel Pozeilev ben Miriam and Avraham Zichronah Livracha. Okay, we started the 10th parak yesterday. We started the issue of Hamatznia Lezera. We came back to this topic that we started in the 7th parak. If you remember, we started the 7th parak was Zek Klal Gadol. This is the big issue. And then we saw also that then there's a klal acher. There's a different rule that was also about the matzniah, that if you take an object, right, we started with klal gadol about all the malachot, and then we moved to the issue of hotza'ah, and that's how we started the whole topic. And then we talked about if you designate something, if you store it and you put it to store, then already it's going to be in a different category and a smaller measure is going to be in place. So what we had yesterday was we talked about that already a minimum amount is already going to be obligated if you stored the item for a particular use. Then if you remember, we said, well, why do you need to say if you stored it for a particular use? Just by carrying it out for a particular use, you would be obligated. Not only if you stored it, even if you didn't store it. If you start taking it out to plant, then we're going to have a much smaller, right? We're going to say bekolshu because you obviously considered it significant. So to which Abaye answered, well, what they really meant about storing was to teach you that if you stored it and then forgot why you stored it, and then let's say you stored it for planting and you forgot why, and then you took it out, and you don't know why you took it out. You didn't take it out for planting. Since you stored it for planting, you're already going to be obligated. We don't say, oh, well, since you forgot, you must have canceled out what you intended. No, your actual intention is still there. As long as you don't change your intention, okay, and today we're going to talk a bunch of cases about what if you change your intention in the middle even, then basically we're going to say, we're going to keep your original machshava, you're actually going to be obligated for the smaller amount. So now we're going to start with the second line. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Mechayev haya Rabbi Meir, af b'motzi chita achad lizriya. So Shmuel says this seemingly strange line, and I'll tell you why it's strange in a minute. Rabbi Meir is mechayev even for 1 grain for planting. Now, that's exactly what our Mishnah said. Hamotzi lezera uledugma lerefuah. You're chayav b'kol shehu. So any amount. Now, a stam mishnah, a mishnah that's not attributed to anybody, we consider is Rabbi Meir. There's a general principle, stam mishnah Rabbi Meir. So why is Shmuel telling us that Rabbi Meir is mechayev even 1 seed if the Mishnah already said that? That's basically what the Mishnah says. If your intention is for planting, then you're going to be obligated. So the Gemara says, Pshita, Shmuel, what you're telling us is obvious, or what Rav Yehuda is telling us in the name of Shmuel, totally obvious. Kolshu t'nan. It says kolshu in the Mishnah. That's pretty clear then. So they answer, Ma'u detema kolshu la'fuke migol geret, ula olama de'ika kazayit kamash malan. Maybe when they said kolshu, any amount, they didn't really mean kolshu. You might have thought this. Okay, why not? Well, we're talking about seeds that are edible. Now, food, we generally say, is grogeret, is the size of a fig. So maybe when it said kolshu, it meant, relatively speaking, it's like kolshuhu, because it's less than a fig, it's more like an olive. And maybe what it meant is, it just means it doesn't have the shear for eating anymore. We're going to drop it down a level. And what's the standard? The standard shiurim in general are kazayit for other things. Unless we know otherwise some unique shiur, we generally say it's kazayit. So maybe kolshu just meant it's like a kazayit, okay? Meaning it doesn't really mean literally kolshu. Therefore, Shmuel needed to tell us that really Rabbi Meir is chayav kolshuhu. 1 seed, you're already obligated. Now we're moving back to Abaye, and that's why I started with it to review, because now we're going to have a question on Abaye. So Abaye said you might have thought that batla machshavto if you forgot, right? But it's not. And why is it not canceled? Because we consider your intent very significant. And this is the theme we've been coming up with all over Shabbat, how much intent factors into things. So if intent really factors into things so much, comes Rav Yitzchak and asks the following question. Matkiv la Rav Yitzchak berei de Rav Yehuda. Ela me'ata, chishev lahotzi et kol beito. Hachanami de lo mechayev adam apik lekule. If my intent is what's important, and this halacha of hotza'ah is very subjective, well then, maybe will exempt me in the following case. Let's say I decide that I want to take out everything in my house. Now that's not a very typical thing to do, but that's what I decided I'm going to do. I'm going to take out every single object in my house. And let's say I get bored halfway and I decide I don't really want to do that, or I just got stopped in the middle. Okay, so let's say, he says, Chishev lotzi kol beito. Am I not going to be obligated until I take out all the contents in my house? We'll say maybe I'm not obligated because, after all, it's my intent that's important. I intended to do the act of taking out everything out of my house. I only took out half the things out of my house. Maybe I'm not responsible. So he's basically saying, how far do you take this issue of subjectivity? So he says, Hatam batla da'ato etzel kol adam. No, there we go by the default. Normal people don't take out everything in their house. Normal people take out items. Now, if I took out an item that a normal person would take out, again, we talked about that there's general shiurim for what, let's say food, a grogeret. So if within taking out all the stuff in my house, I happen to take out a grogeret of food, of course I'm going to be obligated. So now what's the difference between this case and what Abaye said? Well, first of all, we're talking about obligating versus not obligating. In other words, in the other case, he took out something less than everybody else. In this case, I took out something more than everybody else. So in order to exempt me, we're not going to exempt me if I already surpassed what the average person does. There's what the average person does, and then let's say I intended to do something less than everybody else, then I'm obligated, right? If I actually did that less, because for me it was significant. So I'm less than everybody else, I'm going to actually be obligated. But if I passed what the average person does, I did that, but I didn't do exactly what I intended, we're not going to exempt me for that because I did, right? So they're trying to say there's an interplay between being objective and subjective. There's certain objective standards that by taking anything out of my house in the regular shear, I'm going to be obligated. We're not going to exempt me from that, even though I didn't actually fulfill exactly what I intended to do. Okay, so therefore we can't take it in that direction. Okay, I'm just mentioning, for those who didn't hear, there's a sheet today and it'll help organize the sugyot, certainly going forward. So you can find it on the website, on the study guide, the button for the study guide. B'chol adam ein chayavin alav ela kishiuro. Okay, any person. Now, what did the Mishnah say? If I put something aside, I stored it for the purposes of planting, then I'm going to be obligated even for a smaller amount. But if you took that item that I stored and you took it outside, you're not going to be obligated because, again, this is subjective. You're not taking it out to plant, right? I intended it for planting, but you're just an average person and we go by what the average person does. The fact that I made this item significant, it's only significant for me, but not for you. Now, if you recall, when we talked about this a while back, in the 7th chapter, we said that there was a machloket about it, and that's exactly what the Mishnah is going to tell, the Gemara is going to tell us. Now, matnitin or Mishnah deloka Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. It doesn't hold like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. He has a different approach. Titanya, as it says in the following Braita. Klal amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. He said the following principle: Kol she'eno kasher lahatzniya ve'ein matzniim kamohu. Anything that's not a type of item that people generally store, or not the amount that people store of the item, vihuchshar lezeh, but somebody did store it, vihitznio, and right, and as he said, I want to store this, and he did. Uva acher v'hotzi, somebody else came along and took that item that I had stored. Nitchayev zeh b'machshavto shel zeh. This item now has my intent upon it, even if you're the one who carries it out. So you will be obligated according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and that doesn't match the opinion in our Mishnah. Okay, our Mishnah doesn't say that. So basically, our Mishnah doesn't hold by Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Amar Rava. Now we're going to start with a whole bunch of statements and then questions that Rava says. Okay, we're going to have a lot of these nitpicky kind of questions, which are really, you have to view them, as far as I can say, as a way. They're not really practical questions, I don't think. At least some of them you'll see are really kind of impractical. But he's trying to, usually they use these questions as ways to get down to the bottom line about how this works. We're going to have a bunch of things that we're going to review about the laws of carrying out on Shabbat that we learned mostly in the beginning of the Masechet, which is, if you carry an item from, In order to be chayav, it has to be from a private domain to a public domain, or a public domain to a private domain. That's the only case you're going to be chayav from Torah law. And you need the following 2 acts. There's 2 acts that go into carrying. One is removing it from one place and putting it down into the second place. So you're going to have to remove it, let's say, from the private domain and place it in the public domain in order to be obligated. So now, Rava is going to say the following. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Okay, we're about 15 lines from the top. Hotzi ki grogeret la'achila. Let's say you take out a grogeret for eating, which is the shiur that you're responsible for, a fig. V'nimlach alei lizriya. But then, after you picked it up and took it out, right, you lifted it in Reshut Rabim and you basically had an akira, and then you change your mind and you decide you plan to plant it. And when you put it down in Reshut Rabim, it was to plant. So you change from taking it out for food purposes, for eating, to planting. Inami, alternatively, you took out a grogeret for planting, lizri'ah, and then you changed your mind in the middle, and when it came time for the second act of putting it down, you were planning to eat it. Chayav, you're obligated. Okay, so now the Gemara says, this is a very obvious halacha, pshita. Zil hachi kashira, v'zil hachi kashira. In the case you described, Rava, either which way you had a grogeret for, if you had a grogeret for eating and you had a grogeret for planting, either which way you're obligated. You're obligated for planting, even if it was less than it, and you're obligated for eating if it's a grogeret. So of course you're going to be obligated. When you picked it up, you had intent to do something that was forbidden. And when you put it down, you had intent to do something that was forbidden. So of course, so why are you saying this? Right? Whether you did it for eating or whether you did it for planting, you would have been obligated. So ma'u detema, you might have thought, again, this is all about how important is your intent. If you intended to eat it when you did akira, but then you changed your mind and decided to plant, well, then that's not the same act. It's true you're carrying, but you're carrying for a different intent. So maybe you'll say, v'haleka, here you don't have one intent all along. So your act of akira, of uprooting, and your act of putting down can't be combined because your thought process wasn't the same. You weren't carrying it for the same purpose. Maybe you would have thought that wouldn't be. Kamash malan. It teaches you, no, it doesn't matter. In the end, you intended to take something out, and you had the requisite amount for either case, so therefore you're going to be obligated. But now come the more complex questions. You can see where they're going to go with this. Maybe you can see. If not, we'll see right now. By Rava, hotzi chatzi grogeret lizri'ah. Let's say, I don't know if you would have come up with this case. This is a creative one. You take out half a grogeret for planting. Then what happens? Now, obviously, you're going to switch to achila. Now, if you switch to achila, you're going to have a problem because you're not going to have a chatzi grogeret. Well, it won't be a problem. You actually won't be obligated because you don't have a full grogeret. But what if you took out a half a grogeret for planting? Then in the middle, tafcha, it swells. And now it's the size of a fig. So when you uprooted it, it wasn't the size of a fig. I see your expressions, right? This is a crazy case. Then, wait till you see the other cases. Then it swells. Now, nimlach alei la'achila, and then you decide before you put it down in Reshut Rabim, that in the public domain, that you want to eat it. So mahu, what's the case? What's the halacha? Im timtza lomar, if you want to say, in the previous case that Rava gave the halacha, hatam hu demechayiv, there you're going to be obligated. Why? To zil hachi kashira, zil hachi kashira. Either which way, there was a grogeret from the beginning. But in this case, kevan de be'ina da'afka, when he removed it from Reshut Yachid, when he picked it up, he did the akira, the uprooting. Lo hava be'shir achila, lo mechayiv. Maybe you'll say, in order to be chayiv for hotzah, for achila, even though when you put it down, it had the grogeret, the fig, when you picked it up, it didn't, so therefore maybe you're not obligated. O dilma, or do we say, kevan di'ilu ishtik, v'lo chashiv alei, mechayiv ha'machshava dizriya, therefore hashanami mechayiv. Or maybe we say, if you had been silent, if you hadn't said anything, right? You didn't, it's interesting they say saying, because what it really means is you hadn't changed your mind. Okay, but we always have this, by the way, about, right? It says if you were silent, meaning you didn't open your mouth. What it really means is you didn't change your intent. Now, we always have this problem. It comes up when we talk about pigul and a korban, when you have the wrong intent. Do we mean, there's a big machloket there, do we mean that you actually had to express your intent in words or not? This would maybe be a proof for the fact that when we say machshava, we mean you had to actually express it in words, because they say silencing. Unless you could explain silence just means silenced your thoughts. But either way, let's go with what they're saying. If you hadn't changed your mind at all, what would have happened? Well, you took a chatzi grogeret for planting. If you had kept on with it, and you put it down in Reshut HaRabim as planting, you would have been obligated because you had enough of a shiur. So therefore, since you would have been mechayev on the first machshava, on the akira, therefore maybe we'd say, hashanami mechayev. The fact that you change your mind for achila doesn't mean that your akira has to have had a shiur for achila. Because if your akira, if you hadn't changed your mind, it would have been a problematic akira. So therefore, let's just assume that it will continue here. So we don't know which way to go here, okay? It could go that you're obligated. It could go that you're not. Now, what happens? Imtim Salomar, now what they're going to say is like this. This is the way their questions build. Imtim Salomar structure means, if you say, okay, we have this split. We don't know where we're going to go with this. We don't have an answer. So you might go one way and you might go the other way. Now they're going to say, well, if we go in one direction, if we say, V'imtim Salomar, kevan de'ilu ishtik, if you want to go with the answer that, okay, we don't know which way you would go, but if you're to answer the previous question and say, since if he was silent, v'lo chashiv aleh, mechayev ha'machshava dizriya, he would have been obligated because his akira was really a problematic akira, because he did have the shear for zriya, for planting, hashtanami mechayev, therefore you'd be obligated in this case. What about the following case? Let's say, okay, let's take it one step farther. Hotzi kigrogeret lachila. You took out a fig for eating. Okay, so you had the right shiur. Vitsamka, and then it shrunk. Okay, so instead of expanding, it now shrinks. Now, if you had continued with your original intent, what would happen now? You wouldn't be obligated because when you put it down in Reshut HaRabim, in the public domain, you don't have a grogeret anymore because it shrunk. But in your case, what did you do? Nimlach alei lizriya, but you changed your mind and you said, now I want to plant it. Mahu. Do you say, hacha vadai ki ishtik hamachshava kamaita lo mechayev? Maybe you would say, well, if you want to go with your original intent, in this case, your original intent wouldn't actually have obligated you. In the previous case, it would have, because you had enough for Zriya and you would have continued with Zriya. Here, you had enough for Achila in the beginning, but you didn't have enough at the end. So therefore, maybe we'd say you're not Chayav. O Dilma, batar hashta azlinanu mechayev, or do we say no? Let's go by what you did now. Now you want it for planting, so now you're obligated because you have enough of a shiur for planting. So you had a good akira. In other words, this is like saying 1 + 1 is 2. You had one was solid. You had a food that you took out that was a grogeret. Now you have another new one, and this one is planting, and it's less than a shiur of a grogeret, but that actually would obligate you. So do we put 1 + 1 together and say that actually equals 2, or do 1 and 1 have to be exactly the same? Do we have to have some continuity here? So now they even continue with another question. Let's say you'd say, look, we go by what it is now. So your akira, you had an akira of achila, that was good. So you're obligated. You had an akira of hanacha, that was also, you had a hanacha, a placing in Reshut HaRabim, that was also obligatory, because that would obligate you because it was zri'ah. You were planting it at that point, it was less than a shiur, so you'd be obligated. But what if, okay, here's the really creative case. Hotzi ki grogeret lachila. You take out a grogeret for achila. Vitsamka, it shrinks. V'chazra v'tavcha, and then it expands. So in between the time that you took it out from your house into the public domain, you didn't put it down yet. Okay, now in this case, you're not going to have a change in your machshava at all. You're going to still be planning to put it down for eating. But in the interim, it shrunk. By the time you put it down, chazra v'tavcha, it expands again. Okay? Mahu. Now, what's the issue? When you picked it up, it was a grogeret. When you put it down, it was a grogeret. So, of course, you should be obligated. The fact that it changed in the middle, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it might have to do with something. Mahu. Do we say, yesh dichoy l'inyan Shabbat, or ein dichoy l'inyan Shabbat? Do we say, now what's dichoy? Okay, we're going to have a number of principles today that come up in the stuff that are important. Dichoy means that if something is rejected at some point, does it get rejected entirely? Okay, generally we talk about this, that comes up in different situations. One of the main things is in korbanot. If you designate an animal and then the animal becomes problematic, it can't be used, but then it goes back to a status where it can be used, do we say, right, in korbanot for sure, we say there's dichoy, meaning once something was rejected, it can no longer be used again. Even though now it's okay, and right, when I separated it for to be a korban, it was okay. And now when I want to sacrifice it, it's okay. But if it went through some process in the middle that was problematic, it cuts it off, can't use it. Okay? And this comes up by mitzvot, it comes up by other things. In the Steinsaltz, in the Koran, they worded it very well. They said like this. They said, does the halachic designation of an object, prohibition, consecration, or blessing require that the object had been fit, right, from, right, the whole entire time? Or does it take effect even if there were temporary interruptions? That's basically what we're saying. So this object had a temporary interruption in terms of its size. Does it matter what happened in the tahalich, in the process, or is it only important when you do the akira and when you do the hanachah, when you do the uprooting and when you do the putting it down? In this case, the uprooting and the putting it down is totally problematic, right? In other words, in this case, it's going to be good means bad, right? It means it's problematic because at that point you did. Or do we care what happened in the interim? And if at some point you didn't have enough of a shiur, then that's not considered this is viewed as one continuum. And in one continuum, you have a break in the continuum because it wasn't the right shiur. So the Gemara answers, teku, we don't know, right? Teku, again, is either short for tekom, which means it will stand unanswered, or lots of people like to connect it to tishbi yitaretz kushiyot ubayot, that it's the abbreviation for Eliyahu Hanavi. When he comes, he will answer the question for us. Ba'amine Rava merav Nachman. Okay, we're not done yet with Rava. He asks another question. Zarak kezayit truma lebayit tamei mahu. If you throw a kezayit worth of truma into a house that has impurity in it, like a dead body, mahu. What's the situation? So the Gemara has no idea what they're asking even. Because first of all, we're talking about food. Food, it's a grogeret, not a kezayit. And we'll talk about tuma, it's also not a kezayit. So something doesn't make sense here. Lemai. Shabbat ki grogeret b'inan. If the question is, are you obligated for throwing a piece of truma into an impure house? First of all, what does impurity have to do with, anyway, with carrying, right? What would it make a difference whether you threw it into an impure house or a pure house? What would it make a difference if it's truma or it's regular food? Sounds weird. And the shear doesn't match at all, because the shear would be a grogeret. Il inyan tuma, if you're saying, would this be obligated? Would it become tameh, the truma? Well, kibetza ochlin be'inan. You need a shear of kibetza when it comes to tuma. Now, there's a big famous machloket every time we talk about the shear of kibetza by tuma, and I'll review it again here, which is Rashi says, what does it mean, kibetza? What do you need a kibetza for? There's two issues with tumat ochlin. Tumat ochlin is that the food can become impure. Let's say you have food in a house where there's a dead body. The food carries impurity, right? It becomes impure. Also, the food can pass on impurity to something else, right? If food is in a dead house, right, a house with a dead person, it becomes a rishon. A rishon can be mitame sheni, so it can be mitame other foods. So Rashi says the shear of a kibetza, remember, a kibetza is double a kezayit. So kezayit is our general go-to shiur. Comes Rashi and he says, when it comes to the food becoming tameh, for being in a house with a dead body, that's a shear of kezayit. The unique shear of a kibetza is only, can it transfer tumah to something else? In order for it to be able to transfer tumah to the next item, it has to have a kibetza. It has to be a big enough size. To become impure, even a kezayit. But to transfer impurity, it needs a bigger shiur. According to Tosfot, that's not the case, okay? The Rambam holds like Rashi. Tosfot and others say, no. It's a kibetza even to become tameh. Everything about it is a kibetza. To become tameh and to pass on impurity. Both. Okay? So anyway, that's a machloket, a side issue. The Gemara here is just talking about for whatever issue you say a kibetza, plug in for Rashi and Tosfot, okay? If that's the issue, well, you need a kibetza. So it wouldn't be talking about that either. So the Gemara answers La'olam L'inyan Shabbat. It really has to do with Shabbat. And what's the issue? Which makes sense that they brought this up here. But it also has to have something to do with impurity. So what do they say? And then we're going to have to explain why is it not a grogeret. Ukigon deika pachot mikebetza ochlin, b'hai mashlimo lebetza. You had some food in the house, but it wasn't a kibetza. Now you throw in, let's say you had a kazayit. You throw in another kazayit into the house. Now at the moment you throw it in, it now joins together with the other food in the house and it becomes a kibetza, and let's just go with Rashi, and now it can cause impurity to other foods. Okay? So now what's the relevance for Shabbat? V'hai mashlimo lebetza, okay, as we just said. What do we say? Since this now caused impurity to happen in this house, that now you can transfer impurity to other things, or maybe according to Tosfot it becomes impure, do we say that your throwing of that item is significant now, even though it's not a grogeret, and normally you need a fig, right? A fig is in between a kazayit and a kibetza. You only threw a kazayit, but that kazayit was significant because now it caused impurity in the house. So, do we say it has significance, therefore? O Dilma, or do we say no? Kolinyan Shabbat ki grogeret b'inam. When it comes to Shabbat, it's a grogeret. It doesn't matter. The fact that it had significance because you made something tamei, that has nothing to do with Shabbat. So Amar Le, Rav Nachman tries to answer him. Tani Tua, why don't we learn from the following source? Abba Shaul Omer. If you're carrying the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, right? Those were two things they ate in the mikdash. The shtei alechem on Shavuot, the lechem apanim, it was the bread they used every week, the show bread that the kohanim then ate at the end of the week. The shear for carrying them out is a grogeret. V'amai, why would that be? Lema midil inyan yotze b'kazayit linyanam Shabbat nami b'kazayit. There's an issue with lechem apanim and shtei alechem. There's another halachic issue with them. If you take them out of the area where you're allowed to eat them, in the azara, the courtyard of the mikdash, if you take them out of there, you're obligated for taking things. There's all sanctified items have a designated area where they can be eaten. Depending on what level of sanctity they have, that determines where they can be eaten. If you take it out of that area, you're obligated. How much are you obligated for? Not a grogeret. You're obligated for taking out a kazayit, the average shear, right? The standard. So, in this case, if we're talking about taking out the lechem apanim and the shtei alechem, you'll be obligated a grogeret. Why do we use a grogeret? If there's significance to taking them out at a shear of a kazayit, then maybe the issue for Shabbat should have been a kazayit. And what do you see? It's not. So therefore, also by Tumah, it shouldn't be a kibetza, or it shouldn't be this kazayit that you threw into the house that joined with the kibetza. Even though it was significant for Tumah, that should have no effect on hotzah. Okay, that's what Rav Nachman tries to answer. But the Gemara rejects that and says, Hachi hashta? You're comparing apples and oranges. Hatam, there, in the case of the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, mida'afke chutz lechomat azara, ifsale biyotze. But Shabbat lo mechayev adamapiklei l'reshut harabim. Those two things didn't happen at the same time. It's true, they're both called yotze, hotza'ah, but hashta hatam. So because there, when you left the azara, what happened? At that moment, you weren't yet chayev in Shabbat because you left the azara. You didn't yet go into the public thoroughfare. You just left the boundaries of where you were allowed to be. Therefore, and you're not responsible in Shabbat till you actually walk out into Reshut Harabim. So therefore, those two things are not connected. But you're not going to connect the shiur. But hacha Shabbat v'tuma bahade hadade ka'atyam. But when it comes to Shabbat, what happens? When it comes to the throwing the item into the tameh house, at the moment that it became ready to be matame, to carry impurity for tumat ochlin, that was the same moment that you were obligated in Shabbat because you threw it into the house. So since they happened at the same time, maybe they are interconnected. And we're left with a question, we don't actually have an answer. Okay, next case. Last case in the Mishnah. Chazar v'chniso eno chayav ela kashiuro. If you took out an item for a particular use that was a general, you stored it for a very unique reason, and you used it for that unique reason, but then you change your mind about it and you decide you don't want to plant it, and now you want to bring it back into your house. So what did we say? You're chayav the regular amount. You're not going to be obligated if it's just a small seed or something like that, and it doesn't have a grogeret. So the Gemara answers, says, Pshita, isn't that obvious that once you have, and as we talked about, if you forgot, but maybe then we'd say you keep your original thought. But if you actually changed your mind, obviously now when you bring it inside your house, you have no intent to use it for planting. Of course you're not going to be obligated. So Amar Abaye, again Abaye is the one who comes to explain. He says, Hacha b'mayaskina kigon shezar kola otzal umekomo nikal. You bring this seed back into your house. Now remember, the seed we talked about the other day was edible also. It could be food or it could be used as a seed. What'd you do? You put it back into your storage house where you have all your fruits and vegetables. However, you didn't put it in a way that it's mixed in with all the others. You put it in a way that it has its own designated location. So you might say that what? Since it's got its own designated spot, maybe we're still going to keep it with its original intent, because theoretically, anytime you want, you could take that and you can say, oh, I'm going to use this for something, I'm going to use this for its original purpose. Therefore, you might have thought that. Therefore, the Mishnah needs to tell you, as soon as you throw it into the storage house, you're clearly indicating that you're not planning to plant it anymore, even if it has its own designated space in that storage area. Okay, new Mishnah. Now we're back to Reshut Rabim, Reshut Yachid, karmelit, makom ptur. Okay, let's go through our basic definitions. Reshut Yachid, private domain. Reshut Rabim, public domain. Karmelit is something kind of in between, and there's different definitions for how big. If you have an item that's 4 by 4 cubits wide and 10 by 10 cubits high that's in the middle of the public space, that we're going to call a Reshut Yachid because it's already 4 by 4 wide, 10 high. But if it's in Reshut Rabim and it's, let's say, less than 3 tvachim off the ground, then we're already going to say, oh wait, that's part of Reshut Rabim. Anything smaller than that, lower, is going to be Reshut Rabim. Anything that's less than 4 by 4, but more than 3 tvachim tall is going to be called a karmelit. Okay, my mistake. A makom ptur is anything that's less than 4 by 4 and up to the height of 10, or even higher, right? Up to the height of 10 will be a makom ptur. And things that are bigger are karmelits. Okay, there's all different definitions of what these things are, but we're basically going to say, right, if it's 4 by 4, and one second, let me remember all the details. If it's 4 by, right, a karmelit could be, it's 4 by 4, right? If it has walls that are 3 tvachim tall, but less than 10 tvachim, then we're going to call that, right? If it's 10 tvachim high, it's going to be a Reshut Yachid. But if it's less than 10 tvachim, but more than 3, in Reshut Rabim, we're going to call that a karmelit. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this space outside your house called the askufa, which is like a threshold. And it's going to be more than 4 by 4 wide, but less than 10 tall. So therefore, it's not considered Reshut Yachid. But it's not yet considered Reshut Rabim. It's going to be a karmelit. So let's say you take out food, and you take your food, hamotzi ochalim, v'netanan ala askufa, and you put them in this karmelit. Now, I'm telling you it's a karmelit. Rashi tells us this, but we don't only really know it's a karmelit until we get to the Gemara. But I'll kind of tell you already, because otherwise it's hard to explain it. You take food out of your house, you put it in this karmelit area. Now, if you remember, you're only obligated by Torah law if you move from a private to a public or a public to a private. If you move to a karmelit, you're not obligated by Torah law. So if you took it from your house to put in this karmelit, now obviously it's patur, but what they're going to tell you like this is, Bein shechazar v'otzian, if you yourself then take it after it was in the karmelit and you put it in the public thoroughfare, or bein shotzian acher, or someone else took it from the karmelit and put it there, patur, mipnei shelo asa melachto bevat achat. You did it in stages, and each stage was allowed, or again, it wasn't really allowed by rabbinic law, but it's allowed by Torah law. So basically, you're not obligated by the Torah, even though theoretically, what'd you do? You moved it from private to public. We talked about this before, that if you move from private to public and you go through a karmelit, you're not going to be obligated. But according to the Mishnah, it's only if you put it down in the karmelit. Okay, we're going to get to the Gemara where they're going to say something about that. Now we're going to have a second case. Kupashim le'a perot. You have a basket full of fruits. Unitana ala skufa chitzona. You put it on okay, this isn't clear what it means. What it really is going to mean is something that's considered already public. You put it in a threshold and it's already a public one. Okay, it's going to be a space that's a threshold, but it has the criteria of Reshut Rabim already. Then, okay, I'll give you an example. If you have something that's 4 by 4 tvachim wide and 9 tvachim high, at 9 tvachim people use it to put their bags on it. If they're standing in Reshut Rabim, it's a good height for you to take your bag off and put it in Reshut Rabim, put it like on a ledge. That's considered Reshut Rabim, okay? Or let's say it's less than 3 tvachim tall. We already said there. It's canceled to Reshut Rabim. It's considered part of the public space. Anything that's kind of used by the public space is considered public space. That's why this one that's used for your bag would be public space. So if you did that, okay, so what'd you do? You took a kupa mele'a perot, and then nitana ala askufa. You put it on the askufa, hachitzona, which is Reshut HaRabim, Af al pi sherov haperot mibachutz, patur ad sheyotzi et kol hakupa. But here there's a different issue. You take it out into public, but you didn't take out the entire basket. Okay, you have this big basket. You move part of it outside, but part of it's still inside. You're not obligated until the whole kupa goes outside. Okay, we're going to have a whole big debate about that, and there's a good chart on the sheet that's going to chart out the different opinions about this. Okay, starting with the Gemara. First, we're starting with the first case. Hi, Askufa Mai. What exactly is this Askufa case? As I told you it's a karmelit, but that's not clear yet. Ilem Askufa Reshut HaRabim. If it's public, patur. Patur? How could you be patur, exempt? Hakamafik me Reshut Yachid Reshut HaRabim. So you're going to end up going from private to public. So of course that's not the case. That wouldn't be true, right? You wouldn't be patur, you'd be chayav. El askufa Reshut Yachid. Well, let's say it's Reshut Yachid. So that makes sense. You take it from your house into the threshold, which is also considered private. You're not going to be obligated. But what's the problem? The second line is Ben shechazar v'otzian, ben shotzian acher patur. When you then take it into the Reshut HaRabim, you're going to be exempt, but that wouldn't be the case because hakamafid me Reshut Yachid, the Reshut HaRabim. It's true, the first stage was from private to private, but then you go to public, you're going to be exempt. That can't possibly be. So therefore, they say el askufa karmelit. Okay, it must be a karmelit. And what's the chiddush of the Mishnah? Hakamash malan tama dinach bekarmelit, halonach bekarmelit mechayev. It's coming to teach you what? That the whole reason is because you put it down in the karmelit. That's why you're exempt. But if you walked from your public space to the private space and you passed through a karmelit without putting the object down, remember we had this whole talk in the beginning of the Masechet? If not, we'll review it now. You will not be obligated. Okay? So what does it teach you? Right? I'm sorry. Halonach bekarmelit. If you didn't stop and you didn't put it down in the karmelit, you'd be mechayev. You'd be obligated. Because you're basically, the fact that you walk through the karmelit doesn't exempt you. It's only if you put it down in the karmelit. Because then again, what happened? Your akira hanacha went together and those were okay. And then you had a new akira and hanacha. But if you didn't put it down and you just walked, it's not like you put it down there. So therefore it's not. Now that, if you remember, was a subject of debate. So it tells us now, matnitin deloka ben azai. Our Mishnah obviously doesn't hold like ben azai. Titania, as we remember, we learned this in a Braita. Hamotzimi chanut leplatya derech stav. Okay, it's if you imagine the cardo. There's public space in the middle, right, a shuk. There's private space, the stores. And then in front of the stores, there's this area where there would sometimes be benches and the people who were selling things would sit there and they'd kind of, right, you go out of your store and you meet more people. It's kind of an in-between. It's a karmelit because it's not exactly private, but it's not exactly public. So if you took from your chanut to the stratya, to the road, derech stav, through this area, you're going to be chayav. That's Tanakama. Uben azai poter. Because if you remember, we said when you're walking, it's as if you placed it down. So therefore, Ben Azai is actually going to say you're exempt, and our Mishnah must not hold like him because our Mishnah seems to say you're only exempt if you actually put it down, but not if you just pass through the airspace. Kupa shehi mele'ah. Okay, what if you have this big box and you only take, or basket, you only take part of it out, not the whole thing? We said you're not obligated till the whole basket goes out. Like I said, we're going to have two explanations. Amar Chizkia. Lo shanu ela bekupa mele'ah kishu'inu deluin. We keep going back. Those are the big items. Okay? They're full of, you don't always think of as zucchinis is so large, but I was in the Far East, we once had a zucchini that was like, 2 feet tall. And then that's what I think about when I think of these, like these really large vegetables. But even if it was smaller in the average size, okay, we're going to have gourds or pumpkins. That's what we're talking about, because what happens when you move the basket out? You're ending up with, let's say, 75% of the vegetable is outside, but each vegetable, part of it is still inside. So you're not obligated because you haven't taken a whole vegetable outside. But aval mele'ach hardal, but if it was full of mustard, which is usually in the form of, I think what they mean is mustard seeds, where part of them are going to be out and part of them are going to be in still, chayav, because you have taken out mustard seeds, even though some of the basket is still inside, it doesn't make a difference. You'll still be obligated. Alma kasavar, he must hold, eged kli lo shmei eged. We don't view everything in one kli as all together. Okay? It's not viewed that way. Amar Rabbi Zera, manitin de lo did I skip? Rabbi Yochanan amar, afilu mele'ach hardal patur. He says, no, even if it's full of mustard seeds, it's still going to be patur. Why? Alma kasavar eged kli shmei eged. This basket is viewed as one basket. It doesn't matter if some items went out already, some items are still in. It's all viewed as one, and therefore you're not obligated till it's done. Amar Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera now says, Matnitin de lo Chizkia. Our Mishnah doesn't hold like Chizkia. Daika. It's not like Chizkia. Udelok Rabbi Yochanan Daika. We have a few things in our Mishnah. Some seem to show against Chizkia, and some seem to show against against Rabbi Yochanan. And we're going to have a problem for both of them. Why? Okay, because we're basically going to say that our Mishnah seems to indicate itself in the reverse. Lo daika, kechizkia lo daika de katane ad shiotzi et kol hakupa. It sounds like you have to actually take out the whole basket. What did he say? As long as some of the seeds are outside and some are inside, you're still obligated. Because it says ad shiotzi et kol hakupa, right? You're not chayav till you remove the entire basket. Sounds like tama de kol hakupa. Ha kol haperot patur. Let's say you had the basket and 50% of the basket was full and 50% was empty, and you took out the 50% that was full, and inside your Rishut Yachid is still the 50% that's empty. So what do you see from here? According to this, it says Ad Shiotzi et, right? If you took out all the peyrot, it sounds like you'd still be exempt because it says Ad Shiotzi et kol hakupa. So Alma Kasavar, it sounds like the Mishnah is saying Eged Kli Shmei Eged. Okay, it is considered an Eged. Rabbi Yochanan lo daika de katani. It doesn't also fit like Rabbi Yochanan because it says afal pisharov perot bachutz. Now that sounds like, right, because the majority of the fruits are bachutz, right? Even so, tama de rov perot ha kol perot. What if then it sounds like only because the majority? What if all the fruits were and you just still had the basket? It sounds like if the basket was inside but all the fruits went over the border, you'd end up being obligated. So it sounds like against Rabbi Yochanan. Afagav de agida kupa migavai, right? Chayav. It sounds like you'd be obligated. Alma kasavar eged kli lo shmei eged. It sounds like this whole basket isn't considered one. So elakashya ve'elakashya. Therefore, it's difficult. So now they say Chizkia mataretz l'tamei Rabbi Yochanan mataretz l'tamei. Again, since the Mishnah can go in both directions, it can also go in both directions for the answer. So they say like this: Chizkia mataretz l'tamei ad sheyotzi et kol hakupa. When it says Ad Shiotzi et kol hakupa, what does that mean? It means until you take out the whole kupa, if the kupa is full of these vegetables that go from one side to the other. And then they use the last line to support. If it's full of chardal, it's as if you took out the whole kupa because you took out all the chardal, each chardal was separate and you took those out and you're obligated. Rabbi Yochanan mataretz l'tamei, afal pi sharov perot bachutz, below rov perot bilvad, ela afilu kol perot patur ad shiotzi et kol hakupa. He stresses the words ad shiotzi et kol hakupa, right? He says when it says rov perot, he means, well, rov or all the perot, it doesn't matter. What you really have to get out is the entire thing. And if you don't get out the entire thing, then you're not obligated. Okay, Meitive. Now we're going to have a question on Chizkia. Hamotzi kupat harochlin. If you take out, we talked about this yesterday, a peddler's basket, which again, how do we envision a peddler's basket? It sounds like it has different items stored in different places of the basket, right? You don't generally put everything together. So if you have a peddler's basket, unitana ala skufa chitzona, afa pi sherov minim bachutz, patur ad shiotzi et kol hakupa. Now, salkada, you have to take out, right? If you put it outside, even if most of them are outside, if you don't put all of them outside, you're not obligated. That sounds like Rabbi Yochanan. So now they say, kasalkadatach, they assumed that it's bitzrare, that you have these little basket, the basket is full of little satchels of each spice, and therefore kashel chizkia, because that would be like the chardal, and he says you're obligated, and according to this brayta, you're not. So amar lecha chizkia, acha b'mayaskinan be'ornaseh. Imagine cinnamon sticks, they're long. Imagine you have these very long cinnamon sticks, and they go from one side to the other, and that's what we're talking about. He has a whole bunch of spices that go lengthwise, and you end up taking 75% out, but 25% is still left inside. So that's what it means, and therefore it would fit with Chizkia also. Matav Rabbi Bar Abaye. Rabbi Bar Abaye asked the following question: Hagonev kis b'Shabbat chayav shekvar nitchayev b'gneva kodem she'yavo lidei isur Shabbat. This is a question on Rabbi Yochanan. Brings the following source. Okay, the background to this is a halachic principle called kimle b'derabba minei. This means if one sins, and in that sin, 2 acts are done, and one is obligated a more severe punishment, and one is a lighter one. you're going to get only the harsh punishment and not the lighter one. So if you did something on Shabbat that also incurs other things, you're going to get skila and you're not going to get the other item. But it's only if they both happen at the same time. So if you steal a bag of money on Shabbat, you're obligated to return the money. Okay, by the way, this is, if the item you stole is actually still in existence, no matter what, you have to return it. But if you have a financial obligation, let's say you sold the item that you stole, and now you're just returning the value of it. Or, you took this money bag and you used all the money, but now you're returning the value of that money, then you wouldn't have to return it if the principle of kimle b'derabba mineh applied. In this case, you'd have to return it no matter what. Why? First, you were obligated in stealing. Then you became obligated in Shabbat. So, why? When are you obligated in stealing? When you lift up the item and you do what we call a kinyan. That's the act of acquiring it. We'll get to that much later on. We'll talk a lot about kinyanim. But the idea is you have to acquire it by picking it up. Now, in this case, you picked it up. You were still in the house of the person you robbed. Only when you walked out of the house into the public were you obligated in Shabbat. So therefore, you're obligated in both. But hayam garer v'yotzei patur, and this is the part that's problematic for Rabbi Yochanan. If you dragged it on the floor, you're going to be exempt. Sharei isur gneva v'isur Shabbat ba'in ke'echad. You're not obligated for lifting it up because you didn't lift it up. What did you do? You dragged it. When are you obligated? When do you acquire it? Then you acquire it when you pass it from private to public. At that point, everything happens at the same time. Here comes the question. V'isa kadatach eged kli shmei eged kadim le'isur gneva le'isur Shabbat. What happens when you start taking out that bag? You don't do it all in 1 second. You start dragging the bag, right? You're dragging it into a Reshut HaRabim. So now what happens? As you're dragging it, assuming, okay, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the mouth, the opening of it is facing outside. Then, which probably it likely is, as you pull it outside, some of the money is already outside. At that point, you've acquired that money, and since someone can access that money easily, they can just put their fingers into the bag and take out the money before you brought the whole bag outside. What does this show? It's like the mustard seeds, that you're actually obligated. We don't look at eged kli as one whole kli. All of that happened at the same time. The gneva and the Shabbat happened at the same time. But if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that eged kli shmei eged, you're only chayav in Shabbat when the whole bag goes out. But you actually were chayav in gneva as soon as a little bit went out. So they say, right, Isur Gneva, right? Kadim le Isur Gneva le Isur Shabbat. Really, Isur Gneva should come out before Isur Shabbat, and you shouldn't be obligated. So the Gemara says, Ida afke derech piv hachanami. You're right. If it comes out with the mouth open first, then you're right. Really, you'd be obligated in both. But hacha b'mayaskina, when this Braita was talking about, is the afke derech shulav, when you brought it the opposite way, where the bottom of the bag was facing outside, and because the bottom of the bag was facing out, that meant that you were going to end up not having access to the money till the whole bag came out, and therefore you'd be obligated in everything all at the same time. And that fits in with Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have further questions on this tomorrow and further dealings with it.